Welcome to the last Hollybush lecture, the Hollybush Institute lecture for this semester. This is our third talk for the semester. It's on the rise of ISIS, Rethinking the Rise of I.S.I.S, Salafism, Historical Context and Implications for U.S. Foreign Policy. It's also one of the events for International Week. We have a number of events, some dealing with academic stuff, some dealing with student-related activities, so please keep an eye out for a whole range of activities that are dealing with international affairs all week long. Today we're listening to talk and have questions for him afterwards. Andrew Spath is a professor at the School of International Service at American University in Washington, D.C. He's also, in addition to giving talks, he's in the middle of finishing his dissertation. He's also teaching, so he's a pretty busy person. He spent a large amount of time in the field. He was in the region in the Middle East for about 2 years, from 2012 to 2014. Most political scientists spend about 1 year. He spent 2, mainly in Jordan. He says he's been to many other places in the Middle East, including Syria. I don't know what he was doing there. I didn't ask. But he was there before 2011. Also the West Bank and other countries. So I'm sure he'll be able to talk more broadly about the Middle East if you have questions as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew Spath.
Thank you. Hello. How are you all? Good. So I want to talk to you for hours, but I don't have that kind of time, and I'm sure you don't have that kind of interest. So I'm not going to talk to you that long. Can you hear me? Yes. And you all can hear me? And you all can hear me back there? Okay, so I'm going to project since there's no microphone in here, and if I dip below the necessary level, just kind of, give me a finger or something, Be strategic about your use of whatever finger you choose, but nonetheless, let me know if you can't hear me. So in a relatively short presentation here, I want to just talk to you a little bit about ISIS, and I want to put it first and foremost in the scope or in the context of the larger regional dynamics of the Arab uprisings, right? What some people have dubbed the Arab Spring. So I want to make kind of an introductory point about the Arab Spring or uprisings in the Arab world. And then from there, I'll get into a little bit about ISIS, maybe stuff that you don't see in the news headlines or coming across your Twitter feed or however it is, Reddit, however it is that you get your news. Right? I want to give you a little bit of background information to essentially tell you and kind of make the case that ISIS isn't really as new of a phenomenon as it may seem to be. Right? It's not the flash in the pan, kind of very young, recent, emergent terrorist insurgent organization that it's billed to be. It is certainly many of those things: insurgent, terrorist, bloody, ruthless organization, but it's not quite as new as you might think. So that's kind of the goal here. So we'll rethink the rise of ISIS. So first, let's talk about the neighborhood. This doesn't necessarily come out as sharply as I hoped, but nonetheless, right, this is a look at the region, just kind of artistically defined. We have the Middle East and North Africa, the MENA region. Some of you I know study or taking classes in Middle East politics, and oftentimes we group together this larger concept of the Arab world. And then also we bring in a few additional countries like Turkey and Iran and some others to look at this larger MENA region, Middle East and North Africa. And so we're looking at Iran here in the northeast and all the way over to Morocco in northwest Africa. And really, when we talk about the Arab uprisings, it would be nice to start at the beginning, right, of the Arab Spring. And there are a couple of different ways that people talk about its beginnings. And Edward Said, a very prolific writer and thinker on Middle East issues and Orientalism, wrote this great book, Orientalism, you might want to take a look at sometime. Right, he says that the mind inherently wants to identify a point in space and in time that marks the beginning, especially when we're trying to identify that very beginning because the present matters a very great deal. right? So when the present is very important, like this moment of revolution, then we essentially want to identify some sort of moment that began it all. And there are a couple of different ways of thinking about beginnings in the Arab uprisings. The first highlights this young fruit and vegetable vendor in Tunisia, Mohamed Bouazizi, who lit himself on fire in protest to the kinds of abuse that he had received from police and security authorities that were constantly harassing him on the streets. And fed up with his lot in life, he lit himself on fire, and the kind of things that happened after that in terms of government response really led there to be mass protests on his behalf. He ended up dying a number of days later due to his injuries. And this sparked an uprising in Tunisia that would then go on to diffuse across a number of other countries, right, through a kind of contagion effect, that a lot of people saw this as a symbolic act that would represent a trigger for people's dissatisfaction with their lot in life and with some of the things going on in the region, authoritarian regimes and a number of others. A second answer emphasizes underlying structural issues. So instead of looking at a momentary event that was a trigger for revolution or uprising, right, other scholars and other people tend to say, well, look, it's really the underlying factors that explain why there has been uprising in the Arab world. And so across the region, right, populations are very young. There's what we call a youth bulge throughout the region. While education rates tend to be very high, unemployment is also very high, right? So you have a lot of educated young people who aren't getting jobs. And, you know, many people in the United States can relate to that on some level as well, right, in a very tough economic time. Nonetheless, this is a persistent problem throughout the region. Religion serves as a very strong mobilizer throughout the region, right, in which people can identify with their religion. Religion, in many ways, tries to provide answers for why people are kind of finding themselves in the situations that they are. And so that works as a mobilizer for their collective action. And you know, political rights and participation are generally restricted in these authoritarian regimes, right? So there's very little opportunity for people to express themselves, to express their grievances, to express their hopes and desires, and to demand representation, okay? So these are the underlying factors. So we have an immediate symbolic act, on the one hand, that we could say represented the beginning, right? Mohamed Bouazizi, and there are a number of others in different countries. Or we can say that the beginning actually is much kind of longer term in its duration, right? Going back to a number of long-term kind of structural factors that date back to the origins of these regimes decades ago, right? Kind of post-World War II long-term trends. But really, in my view, there are a couple of problems, right, with thinking about beginnings in this way. If you take the single starting point view, or if you take the structural conditions view, right, they tend to overlook a couple of things, right? They offer little understanding for the range of outcomes that we might see, or the diverse trends that we might see in different countries, right? So in Libya, you have now a failed state following the death of a long-term incumbent leader in Muammar Gaddafi. In Egypt, you had the overthrow through popular revolution of an autocratic leader that then was replaced through elections by an Islamist government, the Muslim Brotherhood, that was then overthrown in a coup d'etat, right? In some of the monarchies, you have little reforms to try to stave off larger revolution that in some ways have worked and in other ways have brought on more repression. In Syria, you have civil war, right? So we have a whole range of outcomes. And if we just look at these basic beginnings across the region, we can't understand what's happening in each of these individual cases. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is that they ignore a lot of the mobilization that was happening before 2010. Right? So in 2010, in December, you turn on your TV and all of a sudden there are people out in the streets in Cairo. and then that, or in Tunis, and then that translated to Cairo, and then a number of other places. But nonetheless, if you look back at throughout the 2000s, and even in the 1990s, there's significant political mobilization happening at that time. Protests, labor strikes, riots, petitions, all sorts of efforts to mobilize political parties. So if we think of the Arab uprisings as this kind of major event that developed out of nowhere, right? All of a sudden with its starting point in 2010, then it's very difficult to appreciate all of the efforts that people went through to bring about changes within their societies. And so that was happening far before that time. So the point here is that it's important to look for beginnings, to think about immediate, or what we might call proximate causes, right, for uprising and revolution or any other kind of outcome, like Mohammed Bouazizi or some of these other kind of trigger moments. Or, we can look at these underlying structural causes that take years and years and decades to develop, like poverty and unemployment and, religious mobilization and things like that. But at the end of the day, I would argue that it's easier to find beginnings, and it's more fruitful to find beginnings that relate not to a regional dynamic as a whole, right, revolution across the Middle East, but to look for beginnings that deal with particular organizations, right? Parties, groups, or movements, right? So it's better to look for beginnings that are specific to organizations, movements, parties, groups, because we can kind of better ascertain what's happening across the region by nonetheless respecting the diversity that exists from case to case to case to case, okay? So with that, I want to talk about the beginnings of a particular group, organization, movement, in the case of ISIS. Nowadays, the Islamic State, right, Dawlat Islamiyya. Does everybody know who ISIS is? I mean, or at least you've heard of ISIS? Raise your hand if you have. Great. Good. So the Islamic State. I want to narrow in a little bit on the emergence of the Islamic State. So I guess most observers, kind of people generally think that the Islamic State came about around 2006. Right? This is kind of what most of the media would discuss, that in 2006 you have the emergence of an organization headed by a guy named Abu Musab al-Zarqawi from Zarqa, right? So Zarqawi, essentially his last name refers to where he's from. Zarqa is a city in Jordan, close to the capital, Amman. And Zarqawi really kind of tells the story of the rise of ISIS, and we'll return to that in just a minute. But essentially this is kind of his organization that was defined as an Islamic state, the Islamic State in Iraq in 2006. And of course, this happens in the context of the United States invasion of Iraq in 2003, of the insurgency that followed that invasion, and in the battle that took place, that took on a very sectarian nature, right? It's not sectarian in its essence, right? It's not defined as sectarian because of ancient hatreds between Sunnis and Shia, right? It's actually sectarian because of the way that it developed, right? Because people benefit by turning a conflict into a sectarian conflict, right? It's easier to divide lines to mobilize people when you use a kind of sectarian framework. So nonetheless, ISIS exists in this framework of a security vacuum that followed a United States invasion of Iraq, toppling the regime, disbanding the Iraqi army, and trying to fight this insurgency that would develop. So I'm gonna kind of work against that idea, right? That in 2006, that's where ISIS really kind of came about. Now in 2005, some of you know Ayman al-Zawahiri. He's kind of the deputy leader of Al-Qaeda under Osama bin Laden, right? Operating out of Afghanistan and Pakistan primarily. And today he is the leader of Al-Qaeda, right? Because Osama bin Laden is no longer with us. And Zawahiri had this great idea in 2005 to declare a caliphate, an Islamic state, in Iraq. But his strategy was to wait, right? Wait until the United States starts to withdraw from Iraq, and then in the security vacuum that exists, because US forces are no longer there, right, Al-Qaeda can essentially enter in through its groups that were engaged in insurgency, declare an Islamic state, and reestablish the caliphate that kind of harkens back to earlier, earlier centuries of rule in the Muslim world. And essentially, that's not what happened, right? They jumped the gun. Once this idea was out there that, hey, maybe we should establish this kind of state that is really resonant to a lot of people, a lot of Muslims, especially very conservative Muslims throughout the world. Maybe that's something we should jump on now. And instead of doing this wait and see approach for a vacuum to occur, and then for us to fill that vacuum by calling for a state, we'll just go ahead and do that now. And so you had an organization at that time that was Al-Qaeda in Iraq. It was the branch of Al-Qaeda in Iraq that went ahead and established this, or at least announced this caliphate, this new Islamic state. And it was the Islamic State of Iraq. Okay? That was in 2005. And so this is the narrative. So let me take us back further and go to Zarqawi. So at the end of the 1980s, right, a number of things happened at the end of the 1980s and beginning of the 1990s that would set in motion a number of processes and a number of things that would actually lead to Al-Qaeda in Iraq and then the Islamic State of Iraq, which then became the Islamic State in Iraq and I.S.I.S, the Islamic State in Iraq and Greater Syria, and then now the Islamic State, right? So it went through all sorts of iterations. There were a number of things in the 1990s that brought that about. First, at the end of the 1980s, the Soviet Union collapsed, right? And part of that was the kind of fight in Afghanistan between the Mujahideen, right, foreign Islamic fighters who were trying to kick the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan, right? Well, once the Mujahideen essentially won, right, the Soviet Union left Afghanistan, there was nothing really left for them to do there. So many of them who had been fighting in Afghanistan against the Soviets returned back to their home countries. Okay? One of these people was Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. Okay? He was a Jordanian guy, like I said, from Zarqa, Jordan. He returned back to Jordan. While he was in the Soviet Union, or excuse me, while he was in Afghanistan, he met with a couple of other kind of key figures. One of them goes by the name of Makdisi here. Here's Zarqawi here, very popular, well-known figure. And then this guy, Abu Qatada. Abu Qatada was the right-hand man, essentially, for Osama bin Laden in London, right, as kind of the Europe arm, right, trying to bring people from Europe and from London and from the West into the fold of jihadism. And so these three kind of meet in Afghanistan. He's Palestinian, Jordanian. They all returned back to Jordan. And Makdisi and Zarqawi essentially create something in Jordan that was a new organization to try to call people, da'wah, try to call people into Islam, and more specifically for them, into Islamic jihadism. So here's Jordan. That's Amman there, the capital city. And Zarqa is just on the outside edge of that little star. So it's right there outside of the capital. So besides a number of fighters returning back, including these two leaders from Afghanistan to their countries of origin, like Jordan, you also have at the beginning of the 1990s, the United States war in the Gulf, right? We were trying to kick Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi forces out of Kuwait, right? And this was a big mobilizing moment in which a lot of Muslims in general, but especially kind of staunchly conservative Muslims who were against any kind of Western encroachment in the region, right, throughout the Middle East, in which they were really kind of adamant that, you know, the United States was wrong to enter into that conflict. So this mobilized a lot of them and radicalized a lot of them at that time. And then the other thing that was happening in Jordan specifically at the time was a peace agreement between Jordan and Israel in 1994. And this, of course, also really ticked off quite a few people throughout the region, right? Quite a few Muslims, particularly, again, more conservative and radical Muslims. Okay. So all of these were happening in the early 1990s, and they were centered in Jordan because Zarqawi was kind of the leader behind creating this new group in Jordan. Makdisi was a theologian. He was a scholar. So he distributed a whole lot of literature that brought people into the fray. And they created an organization called Bayat al-Imam, essentially kind of adherence to the leader. Is the meaning of that organization's name, and let me kind of jump ahead a little bit here. They started to carry out very small-scale attacks, right? Very small-scale things. Trash can bombs. They tried to put a bomb outside the American grade school in Amman, right? Very small-scale things. Very unprofessionalized. They were starting to trade weapons around a little bit. They had their eye on trying to infiltrate through the West Bank of Palestine into Israel to carry out some attacks within Israel, right? So they start developing the means to carry out some attacks. But they were arrested, right? This caught the ire and the eye and the ire of the Jordanian security forces, and they arrested them. And they were charged, and those leaders, these two, Zarqawi and Makdisi, were charged to 15 years in prison. Okay? Well, 15 years after 1996 when they were arrested would mean that they would have only gotten out of prison a few years ago. But they were actually released in 1999. And this gives you just some sense of, you know, one of the things you find in many of these authoritarian regimes in general, particularly in the Middle East, was that in 1999 something important happened in Jordan. There was a change of leader. Okay? So the big dynamic leader, King Hussein, passed away of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, right? He had cancer. And his son, Abdullah, who was a kind of career military man, he became the new leader, the new monarch, right? And one thing that often happens within these authoritarian regimes, especially monarchies, is that in order for the new leader to try to look benevolent, right, they will issue a general amnesty. And so Zarqawi and Makdisi, two people who would become kind of one of the strongest mobilizing forces for jihadism in the world, were released in 1999 under this general amnesty. Now, they didn't have quite the cachet to their names yet at that time, right? They weren't the global leaders of jihadism at the time, but they would become that way. So then they started to plot a little bit further, and I'll kind of jump through a little bit of history here. Zarqawi would go back to Afghanistan, okay? He would kind of associate and cooperate and coordinate with a number of people, and then take a group of them over into Kurdistan in northern Iraq. And the goal at this time was to create a jihadist force that could carry out some attacks, you know, in the region, within Iraq in particular. And they could do this pretty easily because at the time, it looked like the United States might attack Iraq, right? We had already attacked in 2001 Afghanistan. It looked like we were going to go into Iraq. There was talk about it for months and months and months ahead of time, and even years. And so Saddam Hussein actually allowed a number of kind of militant forces to come into Iraq because if there was going to be an invasion, right, those forces would then turn and fight the invading power, which is exactly what happened. So when the United States invades, there are a number of forces there ready to carry out an insurgency against the United States and the potential for an occupying force. So this is where Zarqawi, in particular, develops a new organization. First, he helped a previous organization, and then he created his own. And the organization he helped was Ansar al-Islam, basically supporters of Islam. And then he created he created his own organization after that, Jama al-Tawhid wal-Islam, which essentially means kind of the Unitarians and the followers of Islam. And they would start to carry out insurgent attacks against the United States, right? So it was just the opportunity that they needed. The United States invasion was just the opportunity that they needed to mobilize themselves further and to carry out the attacks that they were hoping to plan and carry out in the first place, right? So essentially, in some way, their task came to them, right, by the United States going to Iraq and invading. So now we're at 2003. Right? So we see that throughout the 1990s in Jordan, there were a number of things that happened that allowed a couple of very key figures to mobilize supporters. One thing I want to say about that time that I just find to be interesting is that prisons were particularly important in Jordan for doing this. And it's a parallel if you think about prisons in the United States, right? A lot of times you have different kind of groups within prisons. Those groups usually have some sort of command structure, leaders, followers, and that prisons oftentimes serve as places where guys gain greater reputation, right? For, for serving their time. Right? Now they've been hardened by prison. And essentially that's part of what happened in prisons throughout Jordan. It served a number of purposes, right? So you would have, while Makdisi and Zarqawi were in Jordan, right, throughout the 1990s when they were arrested, they were in prison, they were actually imprisoned together. Not just the two of them, but eventually the Jordanian security forces would put them all together in the same holding block, right, in the same general area within the prisons. And what that did is it deepened their relation with one another. It deepened their commitment to one another. It deepened their connection to one another. It also gave them significant opportunity to delve very deeply into their religion, and in particular into their interpretation of that religion, right? To further expand their ideas of not just Islam, right, but to take it in the direction of Salafism and Salafi jihadism. Let me kind of just tell you a brief word, a very simplistic word about what that refers to, right? So Salafism in general refers to the idea that you can follow in the right path of Islam, you can be a good Muslim, if you look back to the Prophet Muhammad and his immediate cohort back in the 7th century, okay? And by emulating and imitating the Prophet Muhammad and his immediate cohort, that is the best way of becoming a good Muslim, right? This is the idea of Salafism, right? It's through imitation. And, this is a very strongly resonant idea throughout the region. These guys, right, the jihadists, they took it a step further, where they said we need to emulate the Prophet Muhammad and his cohort. But more important than that, or let's say as important in that, is that we should label people who don't. Right? We should label people who don't do that, who don't follow in this path, as takfir, meaning kind of that they are kafir, they are illegitimate. Okay? And their idea was that we're not only going to identify other people as being illegitimate, but we're going to identify the Shia sect of Islam as being illegitimate, right? Because they're not Sunni. And we're going to identify the current political systems as being illegitimate as well. And this is a departure, right? This is a major departure from earlier Salafi ideology, right? Earlier Salafi ideology said we should kind of abstain from politics. We should stay outside of politics. We should be very devoted to our religion. We should try to imitate the Prophet Muhammad, but we should stay out of politics and just not engage in the current political system. And the jihadists said no, right? We should emulate the Prophet Muhammad, we should imitate him and his cohort, but we should also brand these regimes and these governments as being illegitimate because they're corrupt, they're authoritarian, they're decadent, right? And they don't give people, rights, and they don't give people opportunities, and it's been, absolutely terrible economically, socially, morally, throughout the region, right? Look around, these are the problems that we have. And so we should label them as takfir, and we should try to topple them. And that was the concept of jihad, and that was the idea of trying to bring it back into targeting the governments throughout the region. Okay, so I'll kind of wrap up this kind of short history lesson here by saying that in 2006, the United States carried out an airstrike that killed Zarqawi. Okay, so he's dead and gone. Nonetheless, right, that organization in 2006 ended up, as I said, declaring the Islamic State of Iraq. The next year, the United States and its coalition partners did a couple of things. First of all, it implemented a surge strategy of putting a lot more resources on the ground into trying to fight the insurgency. And second of all, it struck a deal with a lot of the tribal members within Iraqi society to also fight against insurgent groups like Al-Qaeda and like the Islamic State of Iraq that had just been established. So just at the moment that Al-Qaeda in Iraq established its new Islamic Caliphate, its Islamic State in Iraq, the tide would turn completely against them. And so they were, in some way, over a couple of years, snuffed out. Right? That insurgency lost, just militarily on the ground. But there was still a small coterie, a small group of fighters who in the western desert of Iraq, which I don't think I have a map of Iraq here, but this is the western desert kind of over near Jordan, would kind of hunker down, right, and bide their time and revert back to that original strategy of let's wait until the occupier leaves Iraq, right, and then we can see what opportunities lie for us. Right? So once they were defeated on the battlefield in 2009, they said, let's regroup and let's wait for our opportunity. And then in the security vacuum that exists after the United States leaves, we might have an opportunity to do something. When that happened in the last few years, since 2011, simultaneously while the United States was leaving, the government that was put in place in Iraq essentially kind of showed its true colors in some way as being a highly sectarian government. Okay? So the government that existed under Nouri al-Maliki, the new prime minister of Iraq, after the surge ended and all of this stuff, and the United States was transitioning out, was a highly sectarian leader. Right? He was a Shia, and he was highly sectarian. And so all of his policies and many of the things he was doing, right, were good for his sect, the Shia, and they were bad for Sunnis, okay? Including many very popular, very notable Sunni politicians who were all of a sudden arrested or tried with crimes, or whose security services were surrounded and disarmed, and these Sunni leaders were now tried with crimes. Many of them would have to flee into exile. And so for many people in Iraq and in the region, right, this showed Iraq's true colors. Once the United States was no longer there as a constraining force, right, the new Iraqi government showed itself to be a sectarian Shia kind of government. And that is the exact motivation that these Sunni insurgent organizations like the Islamic State of Iraq, like Ansar al-Islam, like Al-Qaeda and its various offshoots in the region. Right? That's exactly the motivation they need to say, let's take the opportunity while the United States is leaving and try to challenge these governments. The third thing that was happening at the same time is that Syria was going south. Right? Syria was turning into a very problematic, chaotic kind of civil war. And in Syria, and then I will wrap this up. In Syria, right, you have a leader in Bashar al-Assad, the tall, skinny guy second from the left, and his family, right, that instituted essentially kind of family minority rule throughout Syria for a number of decades, first under his father, Hafez, and then when he died in 2000, under Bashar. This family comes from the Shia denomination, but not even just Shia, but they come from a small minority denomination that there was originally some debate over whether or not they were even Muslims. They were called the Alawis, right? Alawites. And because he was in power, right, in Syria, and there was a civil war going on, and because they are of this kind of heretic kind of sect that doesn't even count as being Muslim, right? The insurgent Sunni Islamist, like jihadist organizations, saw again an opportunity to fight against a regime that they saw as being illegitimate, right? As being kafir. And so that's what they tried to do in Syria as well. And so all of these things combined, what was happening in Iraq with the sectarian government under Nouri al-Maliki, the United States leaving the area, acting as kind of a check militarily, and the chaos that was taking place in Syria, which was being led by a family that represented a heretical sect of Islam, if Islam at all, according to most of these jihadist Salafi Muslims. Right, this gave them all the opportunity they needed to organize, to mobilize, and to try to bring down these regimes and establish their caliphate, to establish their regime. I've got a lot more I want to say, but let me leave it at that and turn it open to some questions.